Maximize your profitability and streamline your operations with Optimal Blue's hedging and trading solutions. With Optimal Blue, you can automate processes, reduce manual errors, and cut administrative costs. Experience faster transactions and improved operational efficiency with tools like the Compass Edge Rate Sheet tool and Profitability Assistant. Stay ahead with real-time risk management and make informed decisions quickly. Our robust data connections ensure seamless synchronization, enhancing data integrity and operational efficiency. Unlock deeper insights with our advanced analytics and modeling tools, and benefit from the expertise of seasoned industry professionals. Optimize your competitive advantage and maximize profitability on every loan. Ready to transform your secondary marketing operations? Visit optimalblue.com to learn more.
Welcome to Optimal Insights, your weekly source for real-time rate data and expert capital markets commentary, brought to you by Optimal Blue. Let's dive in and help you maximize your profitability this week.
Welcome to Optimal Insights, your weekly source for timely market analysis and expert commentary from Optimal Blue. I'm your host, Jim Glennon, Vice President of Hedging and Trading Client Services at Optimal Blue. Our clients and industry partners have long relied on Optimal Blue for trusted insights and commentary, and these podcasts are an evolution of our commitment to keep the industry informed. Let's dive into today's episode. Thanks for being here, everybody. On this Monday, we've got a really good session, really good podcast for you guys today. We foreshadowed it a little bit last week. As always, we'll have a quick economic update with Alex. We're going to talk about, the unemployment report that came out on Friday, as well as some inflation data that's coming out this week. And then we're going to talk about tariffs. We're going to give you just some things to think about there. There's lots of moving parts, and there's really no experiment that we could look back on and say, here's how things will work if tariffs are imposed, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing to talk through.
And then talk about how those tariffs fall back into the things we just talked about: unemployment, inflation, ultimately mortgage rates. We'll hit on where they're at right now in just a minute.
Yes. And welcome, Jeff, as always, and Alex and Kevin. All four of us will be having that discussion. And before we get into the economic update, just a couple stats that we thought were interesting this week. The OBMMI, which is the conventional 30-year interest rate, is at 6.56, so down a little bit. We had a good rally on Friday and just have had rates tick down a little bit, and that's led to some volume pickup. We've seen locks up 20% month over month, so that's this time in December versus this time in November, and most of that's from refis, almost all of it. Purchases are pretty flat, so refis are up about 20% over last month, and volume in general is up 40% roughly year over year. So last December, as it normally is in the seasonal cycle, is pretty slow, but this December is actually pretty healthy, even if you compare it to the last few months. So I think that's a positive for the mortgage industry. And we also want to highlight our summit that's coming up. We've talked a bit about this, but want to make sure we're reminding everybody that our Optimal Blue Summit is in San Diego, February 3rd through the 5th, coming up here in the first quarter. It's at the Marriott Marquis at the San Diego Marina. So please do check out our website, summit.optimalblue.com, to check out the agenda, check out the speakers list, which keeps growing. Check out the agenda and see if it's for you. No matter what your role is within a mortgage bank, it's likely that you're going to have a track that you'd want to take at this event. So check it out. Please do register. As we've said before, we have some wonderful speakers internally. We're bringing in a ton of folks from the aggregator world, the broker-dealer world, the originator community, and also Tony Hawk. Tony Hawk will be there.
Yes.
So if for no other reason...
Tony Hawk, 1.4 billion in video game sales. Tony Hawk.
That's a stat.
Yeah.
That's a stat.
Pretty impressive.
Very impressive. Very impressive. So, yeah, please join us there. All right, let's get into some economic discussion now.
All right, welcome, Alex and Kevin.
Hey, good morning, Jeff.
Morning, guys.
Morning.
We have had Friday was based off the employment numbers on Friday. We had a nice rally in mortgages. Rates are down. Rates dropped almost an eighth day over day, which Kevin was just mentioning before the show was a really big move for what we see for a day over day move in rates. So again, some positive things.
Yeah, it doesn't happen very often.
Especially not now. The mortgage market has been generally boring, or the interest rate market, after the election. So yeah, an eighth was a pretty big move that led to some decent lock volume we saw.
Yeah, it sort of feels like the market's just sort of waiting for the page to turn a little bit. Everyone's just hanging tight end of the year till inauguration.
Yeah, I think so. And so, Alex, can you walk us through what happened with the employment numbers on Friday specifically to lead to that drop in rates?
Yeah, definitely. We just kind of bounced back to the mean that we've been expecting the last quarter or half year. Last month was an extremely weak release, but it was caveated with the fact of the hurricanes impacting the southeast of the United States. We saw 12,000 new jobs, like we said, drop in the bucket last month. That was revised up to 36,000, still a drop in the bucket, but a revisement up is always positive. And then we saw 227,000 new jobs on Friday. So again, there's that return to mean. Job market remains strong when you look at headline numbers. Again, it all comes back to the emerging story about the Federal Reserve and them making sure that they're fulfilling their dual mandate. Waller, he's the St. Louis president. He had a speech last week where he was extremely dovish. He wanted to start addressing employment concerns that he was seeing. I was reading some commentary from Chris Maloney, who we had on about a month ago now. He expressed concerns that, hey, we're not done with inflation, but we are seeing a dovish tilt to the Fed right now, and the economy appears to remain strong. There are, if you dive into the report, there's some maybe pauses for concern. Nothing too crazy yet. I think one that really pops out to me is in the last year, we've seen about 500,000 new people added to those working part-time for economic reasons. So essentially what that means in bureaucratic speak is that your hours have been cut at work from full-time work down to something that's considered part-time. And so right now we've got about 4.5 million folks in the economy who are not working full-time when they would prefer to be working full-time. I'd say that's something to keep an eye on, and it is always unemployment. But for the time being, for the vast majority, we seem to remain in a strong position.
It feels like we're just waiting for momentum in either direction, really, at this point, right? So we're looking at those part-time numbers, we're looking at delinquencies, and those are kind of maybe ticking up. Is it going to, really start to fall off a cliff where we, those types of things that we do see going into recessions? Or are we going to be able to stem that off and continue to go into this soft landing we've been talking about for a long time?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's at the very, on the margins, I'd say that there are some concerns. 6.5, 7 coupons. I was seeing some commentary from BOK last week. 6.5, 7 coupons, which is really the top of the coupon stack, what we originated, even when rates are at their highest. Very few amount of 7.5 out there, but they do exist. But for those 6.5 and 7 coupons in the VA space, there's a 10% serious delinquency rate at the moment. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. I mean, that's 10% of folks in those coupons are 90 plus days, so three months payments late on their mortgages. So I would keep an eye on that space.
VAs are always a little interesting too, with the 0% down and just overall different terms and kind of catering to a different market as well.
Right. Yeah. Definitely not reflective of the whole, for sure. Like you said, Kevin, the underwriting standards are different, and there's carve outs for those borrowers.
All right. So before we get into tariffs and a much broader macroeconomic conversation, just specifically, what else do we have going on this week in terms of numbers? We got some big inflation numbers this week, right?
Yeah, that's the headline number I think anyone in the mortgage industry should keep an eye on. Again, flip side of the coin for the Federal Reserve. Keep an eye on inflation. We have CPI Wednesday, followed by PPI on Thursday. PPI is the one that the Fed really consults. They consult both, but PPI, the cost of doing business essentially for businesses, see what direction that travels in. It's expected up, a few tenths of a percentage point, 0.2, 0.3%. Year over year, that would land us above 2%. Inflation again, that's something that they've expressed that they're comfortable with.
Good. Thanks for the short-term economic update. So again, broadening this out, Jim, you want to set the stage for us today? What's going on with tariffs right now?
Yeah, we're going to try to feed you some information about this so you can kind of draw your own conclusions. I don't think there's any precedent to what is being talked about right now. Tariffs were a major tool, and we'll get into some history about it, but, a major tool back in hundreds of years ago when, our nation was first founded. But lately there's been little experiments with major tariffs for the major developed nations, other than some of the tariffs we've had on China, for instance, for the past 5 years or so. So what's being proposed now in the new administration is going to be 5 to 10 times what those numbers look like. There's obviously speculation on what will actually be rolled out and how quickly and when, and what the effects will be and what the intentions are, right? Is it really just to increase tax revenue, or will there be some use of tariffs to accomplish other political goals? We will find out, but we'll give you all those things to think about here.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and someone might say, hey, why are a bunch of mortgage folks talking about tariffs? And what we want to do as well is kind of bring it back to the world in which we live in with, mortgages and interest rates, because ultimately what happens at the, macroeconomic level or geopolitical level, will have an effect or certainly could have an effect on, our business and, what we're all doing in the mortgage industry.
Right, by way of jobs, by way of potential inflationary pressure from tariffs, GDP, just production in general. So yeah, we'll loop all that back around to what you want to be watching out for, which is some of the things we've talked about today, right? The unemployment report and other types of inflation measurements, but there's, that may be a little bit more under the microscope going into 2025.
I guess we start the discussion with just kind of a history of tariffs. Alex, you want to be our economic historian here for a little bit?
For sure. This is the stuff I love. And I'll try and keep it brief, but I could talk about this all day. Tariffs have actually a long and storied history in U.S. politics. When our nation was founded, it was actually the number one source of revenue for the federal government, actually for hundreds of years, up until 1913 when the income tax was first levied. And so it was the way the federal government essentially funded itself. And there were also political and economic arguments, mainly made by Alexander Hamilton, who, as many of us know, was the founding father. His argument was essentially that to protect what he considered infant industry in America, which was, at the time, America was a commodity exporter, an agriculture economy for the most part. But he saw a future in where America had an industrial base. At the time of the nation's founding, really the only country that had an industrial base was the UK. And so Alexander Hamilton said, we have to protect our industries. We really can't compete with the UK. Actually, George Washington's second bill he ever signed into law was a tariff, and that it amounted to about 25% tax on incoming goods into the United States. And that tariff more or less survived for 150 years, up until, kind of the 1920s, 1930s, when the United States had a strong industrial base, was able to compete with Europe, Germany, the UK, and in a run up to World War I. At times, that tariff approached 90% on certain goods. And so during that time period, it's seen as having benefited the U.S. Hamilton's argument that we need to protect our industry, create a home industrial base, kind of was justified, essentially. Then you have the World War periods. Tariffs were still, I could go on all day. During the Great Depression, tariffs were actually brought up, and that's one of the things that they kind of think made the Great Depression a global event after it began in the United States. Was just this kind of tit for tat tariff war that emerged in the 1930s, and then after World War II, we really switched gears. The United States found itself where the UK had found itself in the 18th and 19th centuries. We had the majority, 75+% of the world's industrial base in 1946, right after World War II. And so we became a big proponent of free trade since we had that industrial base, and our companies were able to compete anywhere in the world very, very competitively. And so out of that, you saw GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, out of World War II, which eventually became the WTO, what we know today as the World Trade Organization. And NAFTA, which essentially what you can think of is all of this was building towards was the United States needed to expand its markets. Domestic consumption was simply not enough, so we had to export our excess goods outward. There's been time periods in the United States where both have been necessary, and it's kind of flip the coin. Where are we right now? I couldn't tell you. We have a strong industrial base, but we've also seen that industrial base degrade in ways. So that's where today's arguments come from.
Well, I certainly feel like I'm ready for my AP history exam after that lesson, Alex. Thank you.
Yeah, that was good.
Sorry, I just checked the timer. I was like, ooh.
That was good. I thought that was great. And I think, so conventional wisdom, I think lately has been fairly anti-tariff, fairly pro-free trade, with the idea being that the more kind of barriers you have to free trade, the more that you're ultimately going to increase prices on the consumer. So, if you're able to buy, things cheaply, let's say in China or Thailand or whatever, and import those to the US, that creates more, people pay less for that. And that creates more income to be able to spend on, goods and services and other things, helping the American economy. And you could also argue that if you're going to not have free trade in effect, you're kind of not leveling the playing field, kind of as you alluded to, kind of propping up, let's say, American industries, which may not be as competitive in certain areas compared to industries in other countries, which could, in economic theory, lead to a lower quality of goods or lower quality of manufacturing or what have you. So, I think it seems like lately, certainly, there's been a much more pro free trade bent, really from both political parties up until very recently. And so now we're sort of getting into a new era where we've had some tariffs in the past. There's promises for more, and it's a little bit like, what does the future hold in store? I know, Jeff, you were talking earlier about kind of how the world has changed in the last decade or so to sort of set the stage for this new era.
Yeah, just to reiterate some of your points, I think there, pretty strong historical evidence for some of the things you were talking about. What happens when you increase tariffs in terms of raising prices, overall productivity goes down, consumer spending does go down because of those increased values. But, from a non-economic perspective, I think one of the things we look at a lot is kind of just the geopolitical perspective. And it seems like that is where a decent amount of this rhetoric right now is coming from, not just kind of economic winners and losers, where in the short and medium term, some will win, some will lose. But geopolitically, we're using this as a tool, whether it's for its effects on immigration from Mexico or, the fentanyl crisis, or just to put more pressure on, I think China is obviously kind of the biggest player outside of the U.S. in this discussion, and China being, I guess, to put it very simplistically, our main opponent at this point. If there are opponents, obviously we kind of, sometimes we're working with them. It's
a good point, Jeff. I think trade policy, monetary policy has become a major tool for the U.S. in regards to achieving our foreign policy goals. For the past few decades, our list of sanctioned individuals, those that anyone in the U.S. cannot transact with anywhere in the world, has just increased, because that's how we put pressure on people, essentially, because we're more of an outright conflict averse country. I think the Cold War created the situations for that. But there's those that we realize we still have to transact with. They're too big to cut out of the global system, i.e. China is the best example of that. And so tariffs are kind of that middle ground where, we can play with it to achieve our aims.
Yeah, I mean, some folks will say even the threat of tariffs will be used to accomplish some of these political goals, right? Whether it's certain countries such as China violating the rules of the World Trade Organization or stealing trade secrets, right? There's been accusations out there about those sort of things. The fentanyl, as you mentioned, Jeff, somehow threatening these tariffs to get countries to mobilize on certain issues that affect us directly. It came up even today. There was an article about NVIDIA. The Chinese government is going to be investigating NVIDIA being a monopoly, and that's the sort of thing that could act as retaliation if we were to impose certain types of tariffs on a country. So there's just a lot of moving parts here that you wonder if some of this is basically threats to accomplish other goals, or if we're really talking about putting 60% tariffs on all of our trade partners.
Yeah, so let's go through. So if we look at conventional wisdom and we were to take some of the statements that have been made, of the incoming administration sort of at face value, we're looking at broad-based tariffs across the board from some of our biggest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and, additional tariffs from China. I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that would say, okay, because of that, everything that you import now is going to cost 25% more or 10% more, what have you. And, haven't even gotten to what about things that we might be importing from, other countries or from Europe, or, what's going to happen there. But if we're looking at, broad-based tariffs across the board, that could lead to higher inflation. If that leads to higher inflation, that's going to lead to higher interest rates. And to bring it back to the mortgage industry, that's where it affects us, because if we get into this high inflationary environment, the Fed would be likely acting to tame inflation by raising interest rates. And, obviously that's going to have a net negative effect on the housing industry and on, the mortgage industry specifically. So definitely some cause for concern there, according to conventional wisdom. But in a lot of cases, we've seen sort of new arguments that certainly I've been noticing kind of entering the fray about how conventional wisdom, may not be accounting for everything. And just one example of that, and then, curious to get your guys' feedback on this, but someone on the more leading tech figure on the right, just kind of following, both sides of the discussion, Mark Andreessen, he's one of the founders of Netscape and close with Elon Musk, and he's been involved, per reporting in the new administration and in some discussions. But he's put out there some more nuanced arguments that I think are somewhat interesting, which, you could have situations where it's not necessarily just you're going to be paying 10% more or 25% more, but that you could have things like currency devaluation happening if you have the new administration promoting a strong dollar, or if you have, other countries weakening their own currency. And what that does is it net reduces the cost of the goods, let's say by that 25%, and then you've got that 25% that goes directly to the US Treasury. So it's not necessarily a straight kind of one for one, argument, at least that he's putting out there. But again, I think, Jim, back to your original point, is this is just an environment where we don't really have a historical precedent for.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking what you just mentioned there. If it becomes a currency valuation war, I don't know. I mean, there is a situation where we could essentially export inflation to another nation that we trade with, right? By making their dollars are cheaper, our dollars strengthen. We have more buying power in China, for instance, but they end up with inflation. And there's also the idea that there's margins out there, right? There's profit margins that some of these businesses are making, and some of those margins might be shrinking. So you don't necessarily have a dollar for dollar increase if you impose 10%. You're not necessarily going to pay 10% more. That can come out of several different pockets.
Right. If you're a country that's, reliant on your manufacturing and export base, you might be willing to accept a lower margin just so you have that, that existing market share. Now, I will say, you guys had me on the podcast to talk about interest rates when they're at 6%, and I felt like I was spiking the football a little early because immediately after that they went back up. So here I am talking about, hey, tariffs, they might not be so bad. Things are going to be great in 2025. So I don't know what that says about me, but
we're trying to give everybody all sides of this, right? I think if you look at just the conventional wisdom and the history, you're going to see folks just point to the inflationary pressure, the reduced innovation, right? If there's tariffs on all foreign goods, there's going to be an advantage to domestic businesses, and those businesses may not have to work so hard to compete, right? If they don't have to pay these tariffs. So there's just these different negative connotations.
Right. On the other hand, so do a classic economist on the one hand, on the other hand, domestically, going back to George Washington, if we're increasing revenue to the federal government, that certainly helps the federal deficit, which reduces inflationary pressure and hopefully reduces interest rates. So there are a lot of factors going into this. My take is, on the whole, the U.S. is going to come out as a winner, right? The U.S. economy is so strong right now. We can do some of those things like, export inflation and things like that. So in the short to medium term, the U.S. comes out as a winner. It's just, how much are you willing to give up in terms of long-term productivity losses for the U.S. to become relatively stronger? I think on the whole, the global economy suffers. The U.S. economy probably suffers some, but probably less than the rest of the world if we increase tariffs is my take.
Right. I mean, our economic position now is a lot stronger than it was in the early 1800s. That makes a lot of sense. We can kind of push this thing in a certain direction and come out on top as a nation. I think there's some folks who subscribe to that.
And even, relatively speaking, like post-pandemic, just, looking at how the U.S. is able to, tame inflation more or less, not fully, but to a larger extent than in other countries, and have real GDP growth that's really been, as I know as The Economist put it recently, the envy of the world. When you compare it to the struggles that they're having in China, or stagnation in Europe that's happening. So it's interesting, and kind of going back to your point, very spicy hot take, Jeff, on how this is all going to play out, and very in line with, there's actually a study that was done, because there have been tariffs since the first Trump administration, some of which that still in effect, and there was a study done that's been shared in circles, again more kind of on the right leaning spectrum of the conversation, where the damage that was inflicted on China versus the US was 3 times as great. So again, kind of pointing to it does sort of seem like it's not necessarily all self-inflicted wounds, or maybe there is a little bit of pain, but it ultimately causes more pain on the other side. Which if you think about it, just in terms of an overall negotiating tactic, or trying to be the 900-pound gorilla in the room, just kind of swinging your weight around to get your geopolitical advantage, there could be some saliency into this overall argument.
And since the election too, there's been, the rhetoric was hot, and the numbers were huge during the election, right? But since then, members of the cabinet have come out and said this is going to be very tactical. There's going to be layering in of these tariffs. It's not just going to be a 60% overnight tax on everything that comes into this country. So I think there's a little bit of reality check there as well. So yeah, I mean, to bring this all the way back around, right?
So what are mortgage rates going to do because of
yeah? And what is, another thing we didn't touch on is that there are certain sectors, right? We're talking about this very macro, but there's certain industries that directly affect housing as well. Like it was pointed out that a ton of our lumber to build houses, which most home sales right now are new builds, right, comes from Canada. Tariffs on Canada equals tariffs on lumber equals housing prices going up even more, right? What does that do to affordability? And then there's the interest rate piece, which is probably what we're all most concerned about. And yeah, we don't know where rates will go. But if inflation does rear its head as a result of tariffs, or for any reason, you're going to see rates increase. That is, history will tell us that over and over again.
So yeah, it's really, watching the effects on inflation and the overall health of the economy.
If the economy is not strong and we see unemployment become a bigger problem, we actually could see rates decrease as a result of tariffs, which is kind of a mind blower.
Yeah. Yep. Brave new world out there for sure.
All right. Well, there you have it. I don't think we came up with any answers at all, but it was a fun conversation about all the potential effects of tariffs. So thanks, guys.
Definitely. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, let's wrap this thing up. Great podcast today, team. Really appreciate you doing the research and having the conversation. Thanks for listening, everybody. Make sure you register for our summit and watch the inflation numbers this week. A lot of good information there coming out in the econ world. And that's it for today. Join us next week for another episode of Optimal Insights, where we'll continue to provide you with the latest market analysis and insights to help you stay ahead. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn for more updates and to access our latest video episodes. You can also find each episode on all major podcast platforms. Thanks for tuning in to Optimal Insights.